So my name is Alicia Ali. I'm a principal lecturer in hospitality business management at Sheffield Hallam University. I'm also part of the CHME exec, and we're really excited to kick off this PGR series focusing on doctoral contribution. And we're really happy to see so many of you with us today on what I can call a bright and sunny afternoon, evening in England. So I hope wherever you are, you're having warmer weather than we are at the moment. So I'll hand over to Ioannis.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ioannis Pantelidis. I am Director of Doctoral Studies at the University of Brighton. And I thought I heard bright on a second ago. The rain stopped here and the sun is out. So I'm hoping this will be a sunny webinar for you all.
And I hand over to Peter.
My name is Peter Lugosi. I work at Oxford Brookes University at the School of Hospitality Management. I'm also part of the Centre for Business Society and Global Challenges.
Yeah. Great. So I'm going to share my screen and go through some housekeeping with you. So if you can just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, that will be great. Yep.
Yep, that's great.
Yep, perfect. So today, our workshop, I'm going to kick us off and I will let anybody in who is late into the session. Today, our workshop is really focusing on doctorate originality. It's around framing your contribution for your research in hospitality and tourism, and we've already done a brief introduction in terms of who we are. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping things I want to go through. As I said before, we'll be doing a recording of the session. So again, if you have any objections, please contact me via email. There is quite a few of us in this session today, so it's quite difficult to always see if people are using the hand function in Zoom to see if they have their hands up. So if you would like to ask a question or have a comment, you can use the chat function, or you can just put your name in chat and then I can call your name out and come to you for you to ask that question if you prefer to speak. So whichever you prefer, it's completely acceptable. We would like you to keep your microphone on mute except when you are speaking, because we don't want to have any background noise coming into the presentation, which might disrupt all of us trying to pay attention. And many thanks to those of you who have sent in your questions ahead of today's session. We will answer some of these questions during our presentation, but also in the Q&A session at the end. So there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So please do keep those questions coming. And CHME is really committed to building a PGR community for you. We have member institutions, not just in the UK, but all over the world. And we want you to connect as future hospitality researchers. And the way to do that is for us for you to tell us what type of events you would like to see or what more you would like to see. Today's session is just a taster in terms of doctorate originality and how you frame your contribution. So if there's something you would like to see us do more in depth in any of the aspects we've covered today, please let us know. If you feel you would value from a different kind of workshop, please let us know. There will be a short survey. I will send a link to you via email, but also put it at the end in chat. And if you can just share your thoughts in terms of what you would like to see more of, we would really appreciate that. So housekeeping over, excellent. Usually if I was in the classroom, I will be I will pretend I'm a flight attendant and doing, fire safety, etc. But we don't have any of that today. So we will just move straight into the presentation. So what we are going to cover in, I would say, the next 30 to 40 minutes, because we also want to give you an opportunity to ask your questions. We are going to cover the types of contribution to knowledge, and I will be leading on this section. Then we're going to cover positioning your contribution to knowledge, where Ioannis will lead off on. And then we're going to look at the role of interdisciplinary thinking in contributing to knowledge, and Peter will lead off on this. So I'm going to kickstart. Types of contribution to knowledge. So I'm sure when you're having these conversations with your director of studies or with anybody who is working with you on your PhD, the question that comes up is, what is your contribution to knowledge? Where does this work sit? And I think a really apt definition is by Laddick and Stewart in 2008, who really talks about it's the relationship between the theory, method, and the context. That's in the middle of that, that's where you're going to source your contribution to knowledge. Now, in doctoral research, especially with a PhD, we also have DBAs, which looks more at contribution to practice. But with a PhD, we look really thinking about what is your theoretical contribution, because that is where the integrity of your research sits. And when your thesis is examined, that is what your examiners will be looking for. They'll be looking for, one, what is your contribution? But two, also if it's an independent piece of research conducted by you, the researcher. So those are key things that they're looking for. And before I can sort of start to talk about what is a theoretical contribution, I think we first need to ask ourselves, what do we understand by theory? And to set the context, I'll use a definition offered by Goya and Petrie from 1990. And they say that a theory is a statement of concepts and their interrelationships that show how and why a phenomenon occurs. However, for us researching in hospitality and tourism, trying to find this contribution is part of the challenge, because we work in a field which is very diverse. So hospitality and tourism is a very, very diverse interdisciplinary field. And also we have a diversity of stakeholders. So it's not just customers or staff, but we have, you know, different kinds of stakeholders, different types of businesses, and different impacts that we can have in this industry, which makes it even more challenging, but I also think quite interesting in terms of how we find that contribution. So the diversity, I think, of hospitality and tourism creates what I would call chaos in our minds in terms of how we actually frame that contribution to knowledge. But when we think about contribution to knowledge, words would come to mind are newness. So they always say that your doctorate should be something new. It should be something interesting, but the word interesting also has some connotation, because we're not looking at interesting in terms of entertainment value, but probably more entertainment in terms of interestingness in the field, and how does that add something new. We also talk about utility, and I'll go a bit more in depth about utility in the next slide, and also around usefulness for purpose. So it's about thinking around where your contribution is adding something of value. And that is what is going to take me to the next slide. So on this slide, I have a framework I've taken from Corley and Goya in 2011. And at the end of the slide, I have the references for you. So if you're not familiar with this framework, by all means, please go away and have a look at this paper, because they really try to focus on what are we considering as different dimensions of theoretical contribution. And they came up with two sort of dimensions. One is originality, and the second one is utility. So originality is something which will make your doctorate stand out in terms of the dimensions of rigor. This is the innovative characteristics of your research. So if your research is original, it might engage with something new or solving some complex problem in a different way. It might develop a new innovative research method. It might have a new methodological analytical approach, or it might provide new empirical material to advance a theory or to advance the discipline. However, they define originality in terms of two areas. You have originality, which is incremental, and originality, which is revelatory. And I'm going to discuss the differences between these two, because I think here is where you can actually see where you're going to be framing your contribution to knowledge. So incremental is what is more commonly referred to as gap spotting. So therefore, having reviewed the literature, what are the gaps? What are the gaps in knowledge? And that's a sort of the first step, I would say, to sort of starting to figure out where you're going to pin your contribution to knowledge. So recognizing there is a gap. But recognizing the gap or recognizing confusion in the literature might not always be sufficient in terms of what is your contribution to knowledge, because sometimes a gap exists because there is no need to research the gap. or sometimes a gap exists because there is nothing new to be found. So, students will always come and say, I'm trying to research this topic in a different context. And my question would be, so what is interesting or new about that context that you need to be researching that gap? So what it is about the context. So that's where you talk about incremental originality, that's more about problem spotting. So incremental contributions are important in terms of you spotting the gaps. However, for this to become more important in terms of how you build that incremental contribution into something which is more revelatory. And this is really around how you are actually theory extending or theory building, or are you making bigger claims in terms of what your research is actually doing? So that's important to think about in terms of your originality. Is it an incremental approach or is it a revelatory approach? Now, in your doctoral journey, you can start on different points on this diagram. So you might start off with gap spotting, but after your data collection, you might actually move to revelatory. So again, don't think your journey starts and ends at one point. It's a process. So you might start at a different point and move along, and therefore you can evidence that as part of your thesis. In terms of utility, Collier and Goya define two types of utility: practical utility and scientific utility. The practical utility is what we more know as contribution to our industry. So how is this impacting our industry? How is this going to have an impact on the sector that we're doing this research for? Whereas the scientific utility is how this is going to improve scholarship. So how is this going to improve the academic research, or how is this going to advance our field? So again, you might not start off with a contribution in terms of practical utility or scientific utility, but in collecting your data, you might end up having a contribution. So this might be a useful way to plot your doctoral journey in showing how you've actually managed or moved that contribution to knowledge. I want to move on to another framework. You'll be seeing a lot of frameworks in this presentation. And some nice reading for you to take away and do to help build your knowledge on contribution. But this framework builds on Corley's and Goya's work, and it was done by Nicholson in 2018. And what they did was they looked at papers in marketing and tried to understand what does the introduction of papers actually say about contribution to knowledge. And they came up with these 5 different types of contribution to knowledge, and some of which you would have seen from the previous slide by Collier and Goya. So they talk about revelatory contributions, where you are actually challenging assumptions or using multiple lenses to focus on a problem. Incremental, which I've mentioned before, which is neglect spotting or confusion spotting. So what is the problem? The other type of contribution, which isn't often talked about, is replicatory. So is it a study which is repeating another study? So especially if you are doing statistical analysis, do you want to repeat a study to see if you get the exact same results? That might be a contribution in some way, and then you build on it. And again, maybe you do a close replication to see if that's happening. Now, type 3 contributions might not be sufficient alone in terms of a contribution to knowledge for a PhD or a DBA, but it could add to your contribution to knowledge, saying that you repeated and tested and the data is the same, or you repeated and tested and something is different, and therefore you're developing that further to build on your other types of contribution to knowledge. Type 4, which is consolidatory, which is around your literature review. So are you doing a systematic review? Are you having a traditional or more narrative review, or are you having a meta-analysis? So therefore, the different types of literature review, which adds to the field, can also help you in terms of adding to that contribution. They've added a 5th contribution is in terms of the contribution to your context. So what it is to your particular field of study that you're adding. So we're looking at the field of hospitality and tourism. So I've added a box here to the right called your doctorate. And that's for you to think about in terms of your PhD or your DBA or whatever type of doctorate you are studying. What from this can you go away and think about where you see your contributions falling? So have you done a literature review, and what type, and how can that be a contribution? Have you done a study which replicates previous research? Have you done gap spotting? So you can use all of these different types of contribution to build into your overall contribution to knowledge for your doctorate. So I'm going to hand over now to Ioannis, who will take you to how you position your contribution to knowledge.
Thank you, Alicia. How are we doing this? Am I okay? You will be moving the slides. That's great. Okay, so I was thinking of how I was going to do that, and how do we position the originality of each one of you when we don't know, number one, at which stage you are. We don't know which university you work with and who are your supervisors. So I think I do like examples a lot, and I need to put a little bit of a explanation that I pretty much, your supervisor have told you that everything depends on your approach to reality, known as ontology, your scientific relationship to your knowledge or your data, you know it as epistemology, and of course, the value that you and your supervisory team places on the work that you do, known as axiology. As you see, I like my Greek words, and so do many others. But how do we make sense of all of this? Well, somebody posted the question about theoretical framework versus conceptual framework. And to me, they are part of the same continuum, although they are indeed different. But here we've got the map of the London Tube. So the image that you see let's start with the image at the bottom left. That's the map of the London Underground in 1910. That was the original map that came out. Then around 1930s, if I remember correctly, Harry Beck came up with his design that we all know today. At the time that he came with his design, nobody really liked it. They hated it. What you see at the top left here is the geographical design. So what I call the original map, let's call that, there's all this stuff that you have to read out there. There's all these theories, and they exist out there. And maybe somebody else has tried to map them. But they're in an archaic form, and you try to make sense of it. So you create a geographical map, which actually is a little bit more accurate. And that is really your theoretical framework. You're trying to make sense of the theory and the knowledge that exists out there, and you create it relevant to your own study. At the end of it, you might come with what is a conceptual framework, which is kind of a symbolic form of what your dissemination of that knowledge is. In this case, Harry Beck came with this design that later on, even though it was hated in the beginning, everybody loved. So really, if we look at what we suggested we were going to do, we talked about theoretical framework, gap in literature, methodological approach, and practice. So what I need to specify here is that everybody seems to think when they start their PhD, and at some point they think they're going to be the new Einstein, they have to come up with something that, a theory that is going to break the universe. But Einstein reminds us that, number one, you got to be balanced. So do a lot of stuff. Don't just focus solely on the PhD. Have a life. Don't take yourself too seriously. And then it will come eventually, and probably won't be at your PhD. It will be as you develop your theory and your knowledge. Let me just grasp the theoretical gap versus the literature gap. So when we say a theoretical gap, one might point to some area in theory which falls short, or it could mean that it's a new theory that hasn't been tested. It could mean that no published theory has addressed the concerned area, whilst literature gap does cover theoretical gap in addition to empirical gap. So in the later theory might be there, but still literature hasn't addressed testing the theory. So how do you position your contribution to knowledge is creating this new approach, if you like, that addresses or tests that theory. So in my view, the gap in the literature positioning and the theoretical framework, at times a little bit easier for PhD students in hospitality than perhaps the methodological approach, because if you look at the strategies that people have used when it comes to using different methods and how they strategize these methods and how they use them, you got to be pretty, how shall I put it, innovative and creative in creating a methodological approach that is so unique and so useful to the field of study that you do that others will copy it. And that's how you have to imagine, am I really contributing, or is it I'm advancing ever so slightly? So be careful not to make the mistake of making too many huge, what shall I call it, celebratory accusations in your viva where you say, well, I contribute to the methodological approach this way, when in fact all you're doing is you're reusing existing methodological approaches. And the practice is an easy one for me, because perhaps I come from an industry background. And that is when you have a problem, and DBAs do that quite often, and you are in the world of practice, and how do you position a new theory that is not just theory, it's theory in practice. So it resolves a problem, what I call problem solution. What is the solution to perhaps a strategic issue, a strategic problem that perhaps the industry has faced and they haven't had the answer yet? I mean, right here, we've got the biggest problem of all, which is how do we manage a crisis that is closing down all the businesses with no real, currently everybody's trying to rewrite the book on crisis management. So if I go to the next slide, please. Now, what we have here, I forgot to say that previously, and also with the map, that there are people out there, because of their own ontological training and their epistemological positioning, that they will, and I say training because sometimes ontology and epistemology is forced upon you. Now, good supervisors will allow you to create your own, but sometimes they'll tell you, you have to have a theoretical framework and you have to have a conceptual framework. And it depends on their training, and it depends on what sort of supervision they had before. It's not always necessary. Just keep in mind that. And I say this because there are even papers out there published. I haven't put the citations here purposely because I don't want you to start reading papers that say that the best research out there includes both. But I have included this, which comes from Prestes and Macbold, I hope I pronounced them correctly, a 2016 paper. And they talk about, in this, this is for them a conceptual framework, if you like. They try to show a model of how contributions could be approached. So if you look at the contributions at the end, where can we have contributions? We can have at the framing, we can have at the method, we can have at the real world problem and the area of concern. If we take an experience report as an example, for those of you who are doing a DBA, that experience report may contribute to a real world problem. So a field study might contribute to an area of concern or even framing, and theoretical development may contribute to framing, whilst problem solving and the research method that comes with that may contribute to the method. Now, the experience report is a paper that's written by somebody who is in the world of work, and is not really work that's done with pure research in mind, pure research purpose. That wouldn't really fall under the experience report category. That could be a case study, for example, done by a researcher. So you got to choose where you are. You can't have it all, because I think there was a question about, what's the difference between a DBA and a PhD. They're both the highest you can get, really. And as far as I'm concerned, in terms of hard work and possibly contribution, they're equal. So don't listen to anybody that says, well, I have a PhD and you only have a DBA. No, they're just different methods of how we approach knowledge and truth. One might give more towards the real world problem. The other may give more to the area of concern. Yes, PhDs tend to be a little bit more theoretical. I like my students to also consider the practical implications, but in a PhD, it would be a much smaller section. The next, I can go faster because I realize time goes, is what I've done is I've given you, and you can pause the video and you can look at that. This is from the paper I gave you before. And this is a really cool table. And the reason why I chose this table is because this comes from management information systems. Now, maybe I have a little bit of bias because my PhD was supervised by a team that was in MIS, and a lot of my work had to do with technology acceptance modeling and what have you. But what I find is that information systems and management information systems share the same practicalities that a lot of hospitality research constructs. So when you look at the type of contribution, they have examples in that paper of work that could say, if I take the very first, when they look at concept, the type of contribution here is conceptual, they give an example of from Zuboff from 95 and so forth. And you can take a case study, and again, they give an example. And I thought this table, these 2 slides, and we can move to the second one, because there's about 13 different categories that they propose. So yet another framework for you to study. I haven't given all the different references that they use, but we have given in this slide the reference from Prestonus and Montville 2016. At the very bottom, of course, they've got the grand theory. And you know, if any one of you come up with a grand theory, contact me later. I might be asking you for a loan at some point. Very hard to achieve that in hospitality, because hospitality is the context. We tend to borrow a lot of theories, you know, from psychology to MIS, you name it, and then we construct a project. But I'm waiting for the time that somebody will come, probably Peter Lugosi, who's going to speak pretty soon next, will come up with a grand theory that other sectors start adopting. And with that, I will pass on to Peter.
Thank you, Ioannis. Can we lower expectations before let's start there. Yeah, so really I wanted to talk about the interdisciplinary aspect of it, because there's lots of questions to ask. And really you're going to be fighting these various forces. It's what your supervisors tell you, the tradition that you're working in. Some of the fields are much more scientifically led, some are much more social science or humanities informed. But in either case, you're fighting against these 2 different kind of forces. You've got these kind of centrifugal forces, which very much are about creativity. And you're fighting against these centripetal forces where your people are saying, okay, but this is how it works in our tradition. These are the methods that we use. These are the established authors. These are the sort of, you know, how we approach frameworks, how we use theory to justify our methodological choices. And often they will have a clear kind of paradigm that they tend to work to, and that's what they believe in. And there's nothing actually wrong with that. The tricky with interdisciplinary research is that you're fighting against it because you're disrupting it, because you're mixing traditions, you're mixing ideas. And potentially you are introducing new voices, you're focusing on novel phenomena, you're bringing in new concepts, or you're taking new concepts elsewhere, or introducing different perspectives. You're trying new techniques out, maybe you're importing them, you're engaging new audiences. And of course, every time you do that, you're introducing risks, because it's about how you trust a different kind of idea, whether you understand the methodology, whether you can grasp the literature, whether you trust these people and really feel confident to engage with them, and whether they trust you. And ultimately a PhD, and certainly in an applied area like hospitality and tourism, because it's very interdisciplinary, you're always going to be fighting against, well, not fighting against, but you're working towards different audiences who are going to have very different perspectives. And it's about how you accommodate that, especially when you're trying to do interdisciplinary research. So Alisha, could we move on to the next slide? So ultimately, you're going to have some concepts in common and some particular contexts in common. Now, if Alisha just presses one more button, I'll unpack that. What I mean by kind of trying to find these commonalities in between, you know, people from very different backgrounds, very different disciplines, very different areas, is, well, what are we taking from them? So is it one particular theory that we're working with from sociology, or is it a particular method that we're taking from them and applying it to our area, which as Alisha and Ioannis alluded to earlier, that might form some sort of an incremental contribution to knowledge, because you're taking one idea and applying it elsewhere. But more important is, what do we think we can say to this discipline in terms of, you know, either the context that we are researching or the phenomena that we're researching suddenly give a richer understanding to how they do business. which is a lot more ambitious, but ultimately you've got to be able to ask and answer this question. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult for them to take you seriously, whether you're going to be going, trying to say you're making a contribution to information technology or to some social science like geography or sociology, or even in an applied field like accounting or revenue management. So part of it's understanding how they articulate problems, how they talk about the literature, how they talk about methods in terms of how they justify it. For example, in qualitative research, they will take a lot of time to explain and make a point of justifying what your epistemological position is. Whereas that probably wouldn't come up in a quantitative research. They will just focus on how validity and reliability can be assured through various statistical techniques or experimental methods. So, and once you start to understand, how they do business in another discipline, you're in a better position to try and engage them. And Alisha, if you just press the second button for me, because the next part is about understanding these mutual kind of textual, virtual, and physical spaces. And that might sound abstract, but all I mean by that is, and this is part of that bigger doctoral journey, is what kind of conferences are you going to go to? What kind of journals are you reading? And what are these other peripheral areas that you might get involved in? And often it's quite a risk to go to a mainstream geography conference or a mainstream anthropology conference, but it's incredibly useful to take that risk because you see how they present their work, how they literally engage the audience. And it's often quite surprising. You go to a business conference and everyone's there in their suits and they're working PowerPoint. You go to a humanities conference or often an anthropology and they sit there and they read out their papers. So it's a very different way of doing business and engaging their audience. And how they, certainly in anthropology, it's about, telling compelling narratives. Where maybe in business and some of the scientific field, it's about having, nice visual aids to really get your points across succinctly. And there's nothing wrong with either of them. But the more time you spend in amongst these different groups, the more you might understand the little techniques in terms of language, in terms of how they present their literature, how they present their problems, how they bother to talk about epistemological issues or philosophical issues or not, whether they talk about results or whether they talk about findings, and how they articulate their contributions to knowledge. So yes, absolutely, conference is one thing, journals is another, but if you think, I don't know, because I don't know you and the audience out there, how you engage with things like networks and lists. The JISC mails, there are ones in all sorts of disciplinary area or subject focus, but it's really useful to be, even if you're not actively involved, but just to see what the sort of things they talk about, the calls for papers that come out, the events they advertise, and some of the more active lists, the sort of things they argue about. Because it gives you a sense of what it means to, what are the things that are important to them, again, the language that they're using, how they are presenting information to support their arguments. And Alisha, if we just move on to the final slide. If we kind of think of what's come before, what Alisha said and Ioannis said, is that there are all sorts of ways of framing contribution. Whether it's about originality and whether it's revelatory or incremental, and they're both fine. But if you're thinking about interdisciplinary work and you're publishing it and how you're engaging audiences, it's useful to think, again, it might come across as lazy sociology, but in this sort of a framework where you might, it's about how original concepts are. You might be using established concept like serve qual or something like that, which is well known in a service literature, or whether it's something novel, which is very new. Maybe like, the co-creation literature or co-destruction, which is, I suppose it's well established, but it's, not everybody's heard about it. But how would you make a contribution to knowledge? So on the one hand, you might have this thing called provocative importation. And this is where you take ideas from social sciences, of information management, whatever these other disciplines, and you bring it back to hospitality and say, well, actually, no one's worked with these concepts before, you know, practice theory or behavioral change or whatever the thing is, and say, look, now I'm putting it to work in a hospitality context. And ultimately you're helping to change practice or change the way we think about how hospitality is done. And in itself, that actually is an option there, or an opportunity there to contribute to knowledge within hospitality and tourism and some of these applied fields, because you are doing something novel. But something even more important, and it's more challenging, is this idea of provocative exportation, where you start taking ideas that might be established in our field and start applying them to new areas. So I'm working on a project, for example, with a cancer unit in a hospital, and taking some of these ideas of service management, about service quality and hospitality experiences, and trying to apply that in a hospitality setting to try and get them to think differently about waiting room experiences. So now I have to, you know, export those ideas. And again, thinking about that language, how I have to persuade practitioners and people in the healthcare sector that this is just because it's got the word marketing attached to it, that these are legitimate theories, that they can be used in an applied field and used to utility. So they can make, whether it's not a huge revelatory contribution, but certainly they help them to maybe think slightly differently about how they do research or how they conceptualize problems. And of course, the ambitious ones amongst you might be, might want to have this idea of radical path making, where you're coming up with completely new ideas and you're taking them to new disciplinary audiences. And this is kind of closer to what Ioannis was alluding to about grand theories. This is where you're really having to be imaginative. So in other words, you're really coming to recreate theory, come up with really novel methodological techniques, and really rigorous work, and reimagine all that stuff, and trying to engage a new audience, persuading them that it's relevant to them, that it can help them to rethink how they do business. So these are sort of different options. And ultimately, what I just as a closing point is bear in mind that these are choices that you make along that 3-year period of your doctorate, or 4 years. But it's also about thinking about the long game of academia. And this kind of speaks to some of the questions that we were asked about publication and some of the strategies. There are some things that you might want to achieve within the lifetime of your doctorate. There are some publications, certainly applied publications in hospitality, it was perfectly fine to just kind of use other concepts from other areas and to make them work and apply them to our area. And that will be a fantastic contribution. But then thinking about how you're going to expand that work beyond your doctorate. What are the, how these might translate into, impact related work or future funding applications. That's when you start to have to challenge yourself a bit and think about how to engage those other audiences beyond just hospitality, because it's probably not going to be enough just to keep publishing in those areas on the same topics, and in terms of achieving funding, and certainly in terms of trying to create impact for your work, it's going to mean engaging different audiences. And that's when asking and answer some of these questions that we've been raised before about the type of contribution that you're making, methodological, theoretical, whether it's incremental or whether it's revelatory, and whether you're actually working on just a technique or linking new constructs together or exploring new phenomenon, how these individually or in combination are going to, help you to come up and articulate contributions, so it's multiple contributions in different projects along the whole life of your careers. And I'll probably end it there.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Ioannis. I'm just going to put a couple of closing slides, if I can just get my pointer. So this is the further reading, so I'll circulate this after the meeting. And these are the references we've used and we've drawn on for today's session. Additionally, CHME, we're hosting CHME 2021. It's going to be online because of the pandemic. There will be a doctoral colloquium, and the cost to attend the colloquium and the entire conference for students is £50. So please have a look on the website, CHME Conf 2021. And if you're interested in providing a short proposal for a colloquium. We will love for you to join us at that event. And your feedback, as I mentioned before, your feedback is really important for us. I'm going to put this link also in the chat after I stop sharing the screen, but also I'll email it to you so you can share your thoughts with us. If there's anything you want us to delve deeper into, or you feel there are other topics relevant to you as hospitality and tourism researchers, but you're not able to access us as part of a wider research community, if you're based in a business school or a school of, heritage or humanities or wherever you're based, please let us know and we will try our best to see how we can support you with that. So that's us in terms of the presentation. I'm going to stop the sharing.
Can I
and open the floor to questions? Yes, sorry, Ioannis.
Before we go to questions, if I just a couple of seconds, a few comments, just to say, as chair of CHME, my thanks to Alisha and Peter for their time, but my double thanks for Alisha, because this has been a dream we had for a couple of years now, and she has delivered that dream, and it has been a lot of her hard work in making sure this happens. So on behalf of both of us and CHME, Alisha, thank you so much.
Absolutely my pleasure to do this. Absolutely my pleasure. And I hope our participants gain some value from being here today. So I'm going to open up to questions. I hope we've answered those early questions which were posed around contribution to theory versus contribution to practice. But if not, please put your name in the chat and we can come to you, or write your question in the chat and we can come to you. But we had an early question on theoretical, empirical, and practical contributions and the difference between the Corley and Goya model. Am I correct in understanding the next question? Is it the difference between theoretical, empirical, and practical and the Corley model, or the Corley model and the MIS one that Ioannis presented?
I think they probably meant, now that I read it, they probably meant the difference between the theoretical, empirical, and practical contributions. That's why I got confused.
Okay. So the Corley and Goya model actually addresses theoretical, empirical, and practical. So when you're looking at originality, it's both theoretical and empirical. So you can frame a contribution within the theory, but then you use the empirical data to help substantiate that. And when they talk about utility, they talk about practical utility. So that's your utility for your industry, but then scientific in terms of scientific for your field. So how are you advancing your discipline, or how are you advancing your field? So I hope that answers your question on that one. We had another question here. If I use to theory to explain one phenomena, how can I determine the contribution to theory? I don't know if
Peter wants to take that one.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I want to, but I'll jump in there.
I can nod afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you're saying contribution to theory, it always comes down to two simple words, and it might seem insanely silly, and it's not being condescending, but it's always the same thing. So what? Right? So it doesn't matter if you're using two different theories to explain a phenomenon. Ultimately, if you want to contribute to that theory, what are you saying about that theory? So in other words, are you helping us to think differently about theory? So is it about kind of extending the theory, or showing a limitation of that theory, or understanding, a different dimension of that theory? So it's difficult to talk about this in the abstract. But say, for example, like forms of capital, right? And there's an established literature on there. There's social capital, there's economic capital, there's cultural capital. Goes back to that kind of Marxist literature. But the point is that you could say, well, the principles are there, but there are other forms of capital that work in different contexts. So you have professional capital, you might have intellectual capital, you've got aesthetic capital or embodied capital, and you're still working around the theory, but you're somehow extending it. And one of the ways that work on aesthetic capital has been extended is because people have written about retail work and hospitality work, and they've applied it, and they've used emotional labor and sort of theories of capital. And because they've used two different theories in exploring the hospitality and retail context, they were able to contribute towards theory by saying, well, actually, this is a particular form of capital, and it's utilized in this way, in this empirical context. And therefore, I'm now contributing to theory. So without knowing exactly what your work is, it's difficult to really answer your question specifically. But what I'm trying to do there is give you an example of how two different theories can be used to explain a phenomenon and how that represents or contributes to theory potentially.
There's also a scenario, if I may add, where you are particularly lucky, where you've discovered that there is never been the combination of those two theories. And if you do that the way that Peter just described, that mere fact could be the contribution. But you got to work at it. It's not just, oh, I used two theories that nobody else did, and here's my contribution. But if you're lucky to find that gap, then you've got a good path towards contribution to theory there.
Thank you for that. So the other question we have is, when you combine two methodologies in your research, which brings a novel perspective in hospitality and tourism, is that a contribution to knowledge?
Only in my view, if this combination is novel and unique enough that you can substantiate the axiology of it, as I said before, the value of it to the rest of the research community, really. If you can combine two methodologies that even nobody else did before, but nobody can replicate your data, or that it's, in your viva, they might even consider it enough of a contribution, but you got to ask yourself, really, having done that, am I expanding the body of knowledge there, and will other people find this useful? Will I be able to reuse this if I want to do a future paper, for example? These are the questions you should be asking yourself as to how valuable it is or not.
I'll just add, is also thinking about I'll use the word in quotation marks, the creativity of your methodology. There is a really interesting textbook by Helen Cara on creative social methods. And that might be something to have a look at, because she looks at a wide range of different methodologies, which we probably wouldn't think of applying to hospitality. So again, in that essence, might be a contribution to knowledge. But again, it depends on how big of a contribution that is going to be for your PhD or your DB, as Ioannis said. So I would tend to agree with Ioannis on that point too. Yeah. So the other question is,
if I just also respond to that point about, because that's an interesting one. About the methodology, Kingsley. I mean, in itself, the two methodologies might help you to justify things like rigor and, methodological or data triangulation. But in itself, that serves a purpose in terms of showing rigor. In itself, combining methods is not the contribution. So ultimately, it's what is really novel that, what are you being told there that can't be told by one kind of method alone? And that, again, it's that so what question. So if you're doing sequential mixed methods, now most people maybe have done a survey research on a topic area, and suddenly you do a sequential study where you do follow-up research using qualitative methods, and suddenly you say, okay, the surveys tell us one thing, but the qualitative data tells us, answers the why questions and how the individual people involved make sense of it, or what the implications are. That's the novel contribution. And ultimately, you've got to sort of, try and tease out, like, again, it's imagine, I say this to my students, and I'm sure it's quite frustrating to them, but imagine I'm in a room with you, with every paragraph you write and every chapter you say, and say, okay, that's brilliant, but so what exactly? And say, okay, that's brilliant, so what? And if you can answer that question repeatedly and say, this is significant because, and have a meaningful end to that sentence, that's when you're thinking critically, you're operating at a doctoral level, and likely you are making some contribution to knowledge.
We've got a nice question here about, do you already mention parts of your intended contribution in your introduction or only in the discussion conclusion section? I've got a view, but I'll let colleagues first have a go.
My view is in your introduction, you need to set out what your contribution to knowledge is. So you start to tell the story, and that is firmed up in your discussion conclusion. So you need to sort of say, what is the gap in knowledge that you're trying to address in that introduction, to set the stage for the rest of your thesis in terms of how you're going to go around the literature review, the methods, your data analysis, and then in the end, your conclusions. What you set out at the start mightn't be where you end up, but you need to set the stage for that narrative towards the end. So that's my sort of perspective in terms of how you set out your introduction.
Peter, anything to add?
I mean, the only thing I would add is I agree. I guess you can allude to it, because the key thing is you're trying to position your problem. You know, you're trying to position your research and saying, look, this is the problem. And that might be a practical problem. It could be a theoretical gap in knowledge in terms of a research problem. And ultimately use the introduction to say, you know, this is the thing that we need to know more about. So you're kind of pointing yourself, if you're going to bother to identify a problem in the introduction, you've got to be prepared to answer it in the beginning and say, okay, well, we don't know enough about this phenomena, or we haven't really understood this relationship, or we haven't really conceptualized something. Then, you know, you've got to be prepared to go back in that loop at the end and say, you know what I said that problem was? Well, this is the solution to it. So you don't necessarily have to, you know, present that contribution right there in the introduction, but you're pretty much kind of establishing everything you need. You're setting up, you know, the question so you can answer it later on. You know, it's like all the ingredients in a good joke. You've got to have everything there to be able to deliver the punchline at the end. And that's why introductions should be probably written last, because by that time you know what the punchline is.
Yeah, I was going to just about say that. And also what I wanted to add, if I may, is what stage are you? Are you near the stage where you're preparing your final draft to go for a viva, or are you at the beginning? And I think beginning and middle stages we covered most. When you reach the stage where you're close to your viva, there, think like you're writing a journal paper. Have you ever seen a journal paper that doesn't have the contribution in the abstract? You have to celebrate your contribution. Your examiners are expecting, that's what a PhD is about, right? Like without elements and proof that you have expanded the body of knowledge, you don't have a PhD. So, you know, your heart and the soul might be everything else, and all the hard work that you put, and the theories and all the methods that you chose and your strategies, but the legs that is going to walk on and it's going to carry the weight is that contribution. So sometimes you got to show off them legs.
So we're drawing close to 6 o'clock. We said the session is going to be 1 hour because we know people need to carry on with certain activities. But we have one last question. You have talked about contribution to knowledge in terms of theory and in terms of utility can both be achieved in one research.
Sorry, what was that again?
We have talked about contribution to knowledge in terms of theory and in terms of utility can both be achieved in one research.
Yes, absolutely. But I guess it's how much, it doesn't have to be, and it doesn't have to have the same weighting. Whereas in some of the practical doctorates, the professional doctorates, that professional contribution and the utility element has to have a lot more, you know, it's got to be a lot, it's a more prominent part of the problem setting in the first place, and therefore part of the contribution at the end. Whereas maybe in a PhD, it can be, but it doesn't have to be. So it's weighted different, but ultimately it's down to the sort of research that you're doing. And again, it's down to the audience that you're trying to engage, what you see the problem is.
And if I can give a bit of advice for PhDs, because it's easier to do it for DBAs, I guess the practical elements. When you finish your PhD and you've passed your viva, obviously you're going to be working on papers, but hopefully you have published a paper or two through the journey if you can. And there is the Conversation, which is sort of an academic magazine, if you like, that accepts a simplified and a practical version of what it is that you contributed. And quite often when you do that, you get far more networking, you get people interested in your work, you might get those jobs that you're looking at to get. It gives you a different angle to all the hard work that you've done in 3, 4, if you're full-time, or even 7, 6, 7 years if you are a part-time student. So consider that.
Alicia?
Yes.
I'm conscious that I know we're no short of time, but I know that we had some questions submitted at the end. Can I just try and just respond to one of the questions, which is about how to maximize your publishing options from your contribution? How do you choose a target journal?
Yeah.
Because again, it goes back to some of the questions you are asking yourself at the beginning and all the way throughout your dissertation, or throughout your work. And one advice that you might just keep it short is to kind of work backwards. Think about the journals that you might want to publish in, and then work backwards from that. So again, think of how they are presenting problems, how they, how those journals are written, who is publishing there, what sort of methods, what sort of papers do they publish in terms of how they justify research, how they, how much weight they give to epistemological and philosophical discussions, how they justify, contributions, etc. That, whether they look for management implications as part of the things, and work backwards from that. And then say, okay, how am I addressing any of these things? And I mean, my suggestion is I'm a pessimist. So I always think, where are the 2 or 3 journals that I might want to get published in? So if I don't get into one, what are the other ones that I could also work in? And think about how you're reading material and citing it and integrating your thinking using the literature from those sources, because it helps you to be part of that conversation that you're eventually going to be contributing to when you're submitting to that journal and hopefully publishing there. So the idea of working backwards, and almost like an anthropologist or an ethnographer, doing your research and trying to understand the community that you're engaging with over a long time is something that I think is useful. And at any stage of your doctoral career and your academic career, because it's often too late to do it after you've finished your, or by that time you've already made a lot of choices. So it's useful to think about that all the way throughout that doctoral journey. Sorry.
Can I say we're reaching 6:01, and I wanted to thank all the participants for joining us. I mean, it's wonderful to see so many people from so many different countries, and I sense a real need to create a community. You're not alone. As a PhD student in hospitality, sometimes you might be the only one in your university, and please follow up. We want to create that community. Come to the conference. It's online, it's digital this time, so wherever you are, join us. We consider you the seeds and the future of, it's only since 1974 that hospitality as a discipline has started growing. We still have a lot of way to go. Let's make hospitality great again.
We will close on that wonderful note. So you know who we are now, so please get in touch. Please complete the questionnaire link. I'll also send it around via email to those of you who signed up, and let us know what type of activities you want to see more of, and we will try our very best to put it on, and we hope you enjoyed today's session. So lovely to see all of you here, and take care and have a wonderful morning, because some of you are now waking up, or have a wonderful evening or wonderful lunchtime, wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good luck with every work.
Hmm.
See you.